The following is the final research report for the class THST 2270 by Jane Hall. This report will cover the following topics. I will start by going over the topic and research questions being looked at in the presentation. Then I will move on to the schedule of research. This will include the methods for answering the research question, what I already know and expect to find with each method, and some conclusions that I predict will be found. Then I move on to the aspects of research that are achievable and not. Next, I focus on the intended audience and specifically where I would publish my report and who would be likely to look at it. Finally, I conclude with how this research project would fit into the wider context of theater research. Topic and research questions. The topic of the research report is on the integration of history and historical documents in historical musicals. Here, the subject of historical documents refers to any person, place, or item that was a real thing that is now being referenced within a specific musical. The research questions that will be examined from this topic include what research goes into creating a historical musical, with an emphasis on why certain topics are kept as is and others are changed, as well as why different items are given different levels of prominence within a piece. The other research question will look at how the integration of historical documents has evolved and changed over time as technology has advanced. To answer this question, a case study will be done that will specifically examine the musicals The Sound of Music, Evita, and Hamilton. Schedule for research. The various methods that will be explored within this presentation to answer the research questions include archival and database research, journals and peer-reviewed sources, and interviews with the creative team behind each of the productions being studied. In order to complete the entirety of this project, the timeline would be roughly as follows. It would start by attending performances of each production to gather a basic understanding of the materials, the staging, and the blocking. In cases where the original production is no longer available, other variations may be watched in an attempt to gather as much information as possible. Next, the researcher would reach out to the writers and creators of each production that are still alive in order to interview them on the decisions they made regarding the historical information they were covering. Given that an immediate response is not likely, in the meantime, research using peer-reviewed sources, journal articles, archives, databases, and even websites, if useful and appropriate, can be used to gather information on how the production came together and what historical parts were incorporated. Before the term is complete, any available interviews should be done as well. Once all the information has been collected, a report can be written on the findings. With regards to information collected from archives on The Sound of Music, the most important aspect was that it was based off of the book The Story of the Trapp Family Singers by Maria Osta Trapp. This is important because it means that the creative team was starting from a pre-established foundation rather than starting from nothing and doing their own research. With Evita, the archives had a bit more information on this production. The creative team primarily did their own research, although upon their research they discovered a book that had been written about Eva Peron, aka Evita. There was one archive that did a comparison between the historical places and people depicted and the story of Evita. It found that while the places tended to be accurate, there was information that was left out, such as large parts of the character's death. The final critique of this database was that certain characters had their storylines completely rewritten, while others had their accomplishments diminished. They then alleged that this is because much of the original source material used had biases against Eva Peron in it. With regards to Hamilton-based archives, again, not much information was available within them, aside from the fact that the musical was also based on a book, specifically that of Alexander Hamilton by Ron Chernoff. Within the previous literature, there is already a framework to analyze the incorporation of historical documents into media. While it is primarily used for looking at film and TV, there is no reason it can't be adapted to theater. There are two models that are used, with the second one having been built off the first. The first looks at 4 distinct areas a document can be incorporated. The first is as a prop, meaning it is not a reference to a specific document, but it is used to set the scene. The second incorporation method is when a prop does represent a specific historical document. If a document becomes central to the production and is interacted with, then it is considered a central subject, the third method. Finally, the object may be used as a narrative device to push the plot forward using some sort of information that was included within the document itself. The second framework then added to the following uses of the previous model. The first use being the integration of documents into the script using direct quotes from what was actually said. The final tenet is using the source of the document as an influence on what occurred. The significance of this framework is specifically as a comparison tool. By comparing how different historical documents are integrated or not in various productions can illuminate the creative choices made with regards to historical material. This ultimately helps to answer the first research question as it tells researchers what research went into creating a particular historical musical. For The Sound of Music, the musical took a lot of creative license when adapting the musical from its original story. Because it ended up taking a lot of creative license from the story, while the places are directly referenced and matched, a lot of the story uses props to represent real historical documents within the piece. Conversely, Evita incorporates historical documents as props, representations of specific documents, a central subject, and as quotes. However, due to the possible issues with historical accuracy in the original source material that Rice used, it is possible that the stories and documents being represented aren't fully accurate. It is important to note that this lack of accuracy because it ultimately affects the historical accuracy of the piece as a whole. However, using the framework can still be beneficial as it can show the intention of what was meant to be incorporated in which ways. Finally, when it comes to Hamilton, the musical primarily incorporates historical documents as props, representations of historical documents, and as a subject matter. Without actually doing the interviews, it is impossible to know exactly what information will be gathered. However, the goals of each of the interviews is to understand the research process that went into making each production, as well as why different aspects were incorporated into the show in various ways, and why different aspects were changed. With The Sound of Music, the best people to interview would be those who adapted the book to a musical, which would include Richard Rodgers, Oscar Hammerstein II, Howard Lindsay, and Russell Crouse. Unfortunately, all men have since died and thus cannot be interviewed. For Evita, the historical aspects surrounding the story of this play were researched and written by Tim Rice. Given that Tim Rice is still alive, he can be interviewed. On top of the information that should be gathered that was mentioned previously, it may also be important to talk to Mr. Rice about the claims of historical inaccuracy of his research and how that source may have affected his writing in general. With Hamilton, while there are many people on the creative team that could be interviewed, the two most prominent would be Ron Chernow, the historical consultant, and Lin-Manuel Miranda, the person who adapted Chernow's book into a musical. For Ron Chernow, the most important questions would be regarding the research he did for his own book. Given that much of the musical is based off of that book, learning the process that went into making it is important because, like with most mediums, there was likely stuff that was included and stuff that was not. When it comes to the interview with Miranda, most of the questions would be surrounding the creative license he took for the various aspects of the musical and why such licenses were taken. In addition, it may be beneficial to learn about why he chose to incorporate certain documents one way and other documents in another. This may be beneficial because it would show the decisions and research that went into creating his musical. Conclusions. The first research question that was asked was about what research goes into creating a historical musical. While the answers from the interviews may change the conclusions made here, it is likely that there are two paths when creating this type of work. Because it is based on a historical event, it requires research. This means a creative team may do their own and start from nothing, as they did with Evita, or they may be using a previously established piece on the subject as a jumping-off point, as they did with The Sound of Music and Hamilton. It is also important to note that when starting from nothing, it is possible that there may be accuracy issues within the piece, especially because the creative team are often not specifically researchers. In conjunction with the research process, as more information is learned, a story may start to take a form that results in creative changes to what occurred. These changes that are made to what historically occurred often seem to be due to the creation of a particular story or character arc that the writers want to tell. Finally, the varying methods of incorporating a document does not solely seem to be based on its historical significance. Rather, it appears to also be influenced by its importance to the story. What this means is that although some documents of history may be important to history itself, if it's not in line with the creative team's direction, it may be incorporated in a more subtle manner. Regarding the conclusions to the second question, the integration of historical documents does not seem to change much except for in one area. With the development of technology, there seems to be less historical inaccuracies and more depth the research can go on the subject material. This means it can result in a more complex story that remains somewhat accurate. That being said, all of these productions take creative license and all seem to lose things to history, so it's unlikely that any of them are perfect. Ultimately, each production in this case study incorporated historical documents into their stories, albeit to different degrees, but there was more accuracy and in-depth material to the latter stories compared to those that came before. Achievable and non-achievable aspects. While there are certainly some challenging aspects to the research process, there are some that can be accomplished relatively easily. First of all, there is a large wealth of information regarding the integration of historical documents into media. Although it primarily focuses on film and TV, it can be easily adapted to fit the models of theater. Moreover, there is a lot of peer-reviewed journal articles on this subject, including information on each of the productions and previous literature on how other mediums have been analyzed from a historical perspective. This means researching these subjects becomes easier given the vast amount of information available. Secondly, although some people who would be good to interview are no longer here, there is still a large number of people that could be beneficial that are still alive. Having this large number thus allows for different perspectives on the creative process that occurred instead of simply hearing a single story. Finally, although the original versions of most of the case studies are no longer running, there are many variations of the productions that still exist and can be easily viewed. So although the initial decisions may be lost, information can still be gathered from what remains. Like with most research, there are at least some aspects of this project that, while would be nice to do, are not achievable. In this case, there are quite a few that may pose a challenge. First of all, while there are adaptations of the original productions of both Evita and The Sound of Music, they have both since ended on Broadway. As such, it is no longer possible to watch the original performances of these pieces to get a feel for the ideas that were being portrayed or the staging and blocking that was being used. Another issue is that there is not a lot of archivable or database information on historical musicals, as it is not the most researched topic, so trying to gather information from these sources will likely pose a challenge. Regarding the data collection method of interviews, there are a few issues that may arise. The original creators of The Sound of Music are dead and thus obviously can't be interviewed for the historical-based decisions they made when creating this piece. Additionally, given that this is meant to be a project done over a semester, there may be a time and physical constraints to interviewing the various people mentioned earlier. Finally, the last issue with interviews is budgeting. Often with interviews, the interviewer arranges for the interviewee to meet and do the interview and pay them as well. So with so many people wanting to be interviewed, it may be a challenge to cover everyone and may result in a deficit of information if only some are chosen. The final issue with this research project is that the original director's notes for all the productions have likely been lost to history. This means that the specific ideas and concepts that were trying to be shown may now be forgotten, and thus again there's a potential deficit of information that can be collected. Overall, there are a few non-achievable aspects with this research project, with most of them ultimately pertaining to a lack of information that can be collected during the research process. The intended audience. When it comes to the intended audience, there are two parts to consider: where this work may be published, as well as who would listen to the presentation. With regard to the first consideration of publication, in a perfect world, this research would specifically be published in journals related to archives, some of the most popular being American Archivist, Archive Journal, and Archivaria. With regards to who will listen to this project, it is unlikely that it will be listened to by the general populace, as it is not something that directly impacts most people. It is instead an advancement in a particular field of research. As such, this presentation will primarily be listened to by scholars and researchers, which may include those who are professional researchers or those doing research for undergraduate projects. In sum, this presentation is likely going to be listened to by those with a modicum of expertise and or knowledge within this particular field, as well as those with an interest in this field. The wider context of theater. This research is relevant for two reasons. The first is that it provides more information on a subject that is not studied very much. The topic of integrating historical documents into media, especially in regards to theater and musicals, is not studied very much. As such, this presentation gives more information on analyzing historical musicals within their given context. In addition, it provides a methodology and examples of how framework can actually be applied to real productions. By laying this foundation and giving examples, it adds to the area of theater research because it shows a different way of analyzing productions that can be done with other pieces that weren't covered in this specific project. The other way this report adds to the field of theater is that it also makes researchers think of historical musicals in a different way. Instead of solely looking at these musicals as based on a true story type of plays, this research encourages people to look at how history has been incorporated, what was included versus not included, how specific is a historical document described and or used. Thinking of these questions while looking at various pieces allows researchers to not only be critical of what is being consumed in terms of its accuracy, but to expand their way of thinking. These are the references used. Thank you for listening to the presentation.